All right, let's go. Inquiries, hey? When things go sideways politically, the script is easy to predict and to write. Someone on the opposition benches will stand up and call for the minister to resign. Generally, that is political baffle-gab, posturing, and grandstanding. Then beyond that, the calls will immediately go to some form of inquiry to satisfy the people's need to know. Oftentimes, we dismiss these calls by opposition politicians because we see it simply as partisan politics and one-upping each other in the House of Assembly as opposed to attention to the best interests of the people. But today might be different. Okay. So, Humber Valley Paving. We've been wondering where this Auditor General's report was that was requested by then Premier Tom Marshall and executed by the Auditor General Terry Paddy. Okay. There's not much in there we didn't know. We all surmised what we thought were circumstances surrounding this cancellation of the Humber Valley Paving contract in Labrador. Then, of course, the controversy that surrounded releasing the bonds. People were telling us, and we were supposed to believe them, blind faith apparently, that it was just standard practice. The cancellation of the contract was in the best interest of the people to get it retendered, and the return of the bonds, well, this is just how you operate, and that's how business goes. Yeah? Well, baloney. What we do know from Terry Paddy's report here is that there are serious discrepancies in timelines and statements made by minister and other members of the government. They don't jive with what they said in the House of Assembly and or media interviews. They don't jive with what the findings are of Mr. Paddy based on his interviews with some 16 people surrounding this fiasco. Okay. Why? How? Who? How did Nick McGraw find out about Humber Valley Paving's intention to request, if not compensation for what they say was not their doing and out of their control, was the fires in Labrador? So Humber Valley Paving wanted to either be compensated for the lost time or they wanted to be let out of the contract. Okay, fine. That's what business will do. But how and when did Nick McGraw find out? We don't know. How come we don't know? I mean, this is just mind-boggling. Every step of the way, when you say this out loud, it's really quite something. So how did he find out? The morning of March the 13th, the day before the nominations closed for the PC leadership race, of course, was featured Bill Barry, Wayne Bennett, and Frank Coleman, the former president of Humber Valley Paving, who sold his stocks and put himself arm's length from the company to satisfy all the legislation and accepted protocols surrounding seeking public office. Okay, fine. So on March 13th, apparently, Nick McGraw calls his deputy minister to say, have you heard about Humber Valley Paving's request to get out of this contract? The deputy minister says no. So how did McGraw find out in the first place? And how is the DM, the key figure inside his office, be out of this loop? Okay. So McGraw calls the office instead of going into his department, and before he goes to the cabinet meeting, he calls, he gets that response from his DM, he goes on to the scheduled cabinet meeting. The deputy minister calls Gene Coleman, Frank's son, to discuss Humber Valley Paving's requests or demands regarding their contract in Labrador. All right. So then Nick McGraw walks into the cabinet room. With no discussion around the cabinet table, we're led to believe, on this, because at that point the Premier would have been present. No briefing, no prepared for the Premier. Nick McGraw says he didn't know who Frank Coleman was in his association with Humber Valley Paving. Like, for starters, can anyone really legitimately believe that? Like, you don't live under a rock, we know this. So everybody else knew who Frank Coleman was, and his association with Humber Valley Paving, and his political aspirations and hopes, but not Nick McGraw. Oh yeah, sure. No, of course you didn't know. So on that same day, when it began a conversation between McGraw and his deputy minister, do you know this? Call me to Coleman. Cabinet meeting proceeds. By the end of the day, without evaluation of other options to compensate for time lost or to cancel a contract, and then the required conversation about the bonds, none of that happens. Instead, what we have is a politically expedited decision on the same day, inside the span of 7.5 hours, to release Humber Valley Paving from their contract, unbeknownst to the Premier, and apparently unbeknownst to Minister McGraw, how this would be not only a complicated and serious decision to release a paving company from their obligations, but also the complicated political scenario that was always going to follow on the heels of this decision. Okay. Why not brief the Premier? Now, Minister McGraw will say that this is an error in judgment, a breach of protocol, boorish behavior by an elected official. When the good news, when the best case scenario that the government can paint, and former Minister McGraw, when the best picture he can paint to remove any further questions, which, forget it, we have lots of questions. That's all this report did, is pose more questions. When your best defense is that, as a minister, I was so incompetent that I'm forced to resign, and in the same breath tell us you did nothing wrong, then we all stand back and we are mind-boggled and our minds are blown. Ridiculous, right? Then we have the involvement of other members of the PC caucus, and in particular the one gentleman identified in the report is Kevin O'Brien. O'Brien called the Transportation Works Department to discuss the status of the HVP contract. Okay. So O'Brien will have available wiggle room here because the paving company will say that their problems started with forest fires in Labrador. At that point in time, Kevin O'Brien was the minister responsible for fire and emergency services. So there's an easy way for them to paint a picture that there was nothing untoward or out of the norm going on there. Plus, it's an important detail, but we all know that between deputy ministers and cabinet ministers and other members of the caucus, there will be conversations had in cabinet rooms, in private, in people's own offices, in the hallways, about issues of the day. So a cabinet minister calling another department, I'm not too hung up on it, except there's also something to be said for the role that Kevin O'Brien played in Coleman's leadership bid. It's important. For Coleman's protection, no undue political influence could have been offered by Coleman because the decision was made, apparently, and this is another discrepancy, it was made before Coleman was an official candidate seeking the PC leadership, March 13th. At the same time, Nick McGraw led us to believe that the final decision was made on March 21st. So which is it? Is it also possible to fully accept their answers and believe that then Premier Tom Marshall knew nothing of any of this? Didn't know any of it? For starters, if you're a deputy minister and you don't prepare a briefing note all the while, and I know this person by reputation, and they're smart, they know it's a politically sensitive, complicated, reasonable debate to be had and discussed between senior members of cabinet, including the Premier, and yet did not prepare a briefing note for the Premier. Consequently, this is where we find ourselves with Mr. Patton's summary, which is unsubstantiated in my opinion, about there's no documentary evidence. Yeah, but we knew that. They told us that going in. That's a huge problem, right? Protocol, for number one. But that deputy minister, like if I'm employed anywhere, government, private sector, and I know my name is going to be dragged into investigations, my position will be questioned, my level of competence will be questioned, I don't care if my minister wants a briefing note or not. I know full well that Frank Coleman is the potential next premier of the province, leader of the PC party. He owned or owns a company that we're releasing from a contract, returning his bonds. I see the political sensitivity. I understand it's an important decision. I need to cover my tail, so I, by default, prepare a briefing note. I put it in McGraw's hands. I have it on my desktop, so when and if I'm questioned, I did my job. That didn't happen. Again. If you didn't do anything wrong, Nick McGraw, why did you resign? I mean, that's a huge question here. You know, we have this, it presents itself all the time. You're fired, no, I quit. You know, so shortly on the heels of the release of the report, McGraw decides it's in his best interest and the party's best interest and the government's best interest, not the people's best interest, their best interest for him to resign his post as a minister and not to give up his seat in Labrador. Then the Premier has to come forward. Well, I guess the Premier went before, and he said that he's received the resignation from McGraw. Even if there was political capital to be gained here by Paul Davis, doesn't Davis reject the resignation? He comes out and says that he has removed McGraw from his cabinet post, and here is why. Does he not say that I'm the boss here? This is what has unraveled us as a government, is the perception that we're secretive, we're not accountable and transparent to the people. And so here's what we will do. I am the boss. McGraw has lost his cabinet post, and here's why. Serious errors in judgment. No documented proof that the decision, even if it was the right one, was not appropriately debated and discussed and proven to be in the best interest of the people. Some really serious, firm remarks that Davis could have said that would have made him look like the leader we need. It didn't happen. So McGraw, with all due respect, not for 1 second am I buying that you did nothing wrong, and at the same time, without even, and then his comments, I haven't had a chance to absorb the report, but yet you say you did nothing wrong and you're quitting anyway. I don't buy it. For a second. Not even 1 second. All right. So, then there are discrepancies in who, know what, when. Was the initial conversation on March the 5th? Were there any conversations? Mr. Paddy doesn't even identify this in his report. What went on before March the 13th? Did anybody discuss this issue prior to that day? Was it indeed at 8:30 that morning or 9 o'clock, whatever it was, on March the 13th, where the issue was broached and decision made by the end of business that day? We don't know. Mr. Paddy couldn't find out because he couldn't get the answers, which is a problem. Then, Frank Coleman. So Mr. Coleman enters the race. Mr. Barry withdraws, saying that the fix was in. Mr. Bennett was removed from the race for the reasons why. So Coleman was alone and set to become the premier of the province. Then, of his own accord, stating and quoting family reasons as to why he was withdrawing from the race, I personally always have, it's tough to go down the road to browbeat people over the decisions when they call it family. Charlene Johnson wanted to be with her young family on the other side of the world. I kind of get it, right? I do. I kind of get it. But Coleman, we don't even know anything about these family reasons. What are they? The PC government this morning, I'm not telling them anything they don't know, with all the open-ended, unanswered questions still yet to be resolved, how can anybody think that Coleman got what he wanted with his candidacy and quit? Right? Who and how were the bonds secured and guaranteed by Humber Valley Paving? Was it from Coleman's ownership piece, his equity stake in his own company? Was it him personally? Was it the company with assets inside the control of the company that were put forward to guarantee the bond? These are important questions. Then they tell me that just because the contract was canceled, that the immediate follow-up and consequence is that the bonds are released without question, with no debate, with no consideration of protecting the people. When McGraw says, we canceled the contract so quickly and in such a rushed fashion without following protocol and potentially littered with incompetence so that we could repackage the work, retender it to provide the protection of the people. Decision made in the best interest of the people. Now, Patton's quick to say that without the documented evidence and without understanding that there was, with knowing there was no further debate and discussion, that the same conclusion would have been reached, but that does not protect the government or McGraw, period. It doesn't. For starters, the government has got to have some approaches to protocol that does not allow any more business to go on without the associated paper trail. We cannot have ministers, premiers, cabinets, deputy ministers going around, and especially the anonymity of these senior bureaucrats. Enough is enough is enough. If you've got as much weight and power that you trump and pat yourself on the back for having, then we wouldn't mind having your name on some of your emails and briefing notes that you prepared to help guide policy execution and decisions. If the protocol does not explain how we will be protected, if Premier Davis's next move is not to say, here's how we're going to do business different to make sure there is always a paper trail available to the Auditor General, that the tender process will be open and transparent, and we will be able to walk you through step by step and stage by stage with documented proof, the paper trail, then Davis will have failed with his first big task. So welcome to Newfoundland and Labrador politics, Premier Davis. You want the big job? You got it. With all the unanswered questions, the immediate reaction of Dwight Ball, leader of the opposition, and same coming from NDP leader Lorraine Michael, is that if we cannot get the answers, there isn't documented proof, Paddy only has so much in the way of power, he can only ask questions with his leverage, the mandate of his office. If we can't get the answers, and I usually poo-poo this and I dismiss it out of hand 99% of the time, the only option left for Davis to truly be the forceful leader that the PC party needs and he needs to present with any hope of not being decimated in 2015, his only play now is to call for this inquiry. Because there's questions that have gone unanswered. When the Auditor General's report poses as many questions as this one does, and the significance of these questions, and the potential for undue political influence, if you can't tell us through this exhaustive, it took forever. If you can't tell us, then we need to know. And if we can only find out under oath, then I guess that's what we have to do. When the party's best defense, and they're accepting, and the members of the government are now retweeting foolishness that says, there's no documented proof that anything untoward happened here, and that decision might have been reached had it been debated and discussed in an appropriate fashion. So nothing to see here, folks-ish. Well, there is. When your best defense is that you had an incompetent minister, that's not good enough. So now McGraw gets to sit in the House, can't ask him questions. He's not a minister, and he won't be a minister. And why? Because he's proven that he's not fit to hold that office. And that's not my judgment. That's McGraw's own personal judgment of himself. That's what he said. His error in judgment led to his want to resign. Davis names his new cabinet today. What's going to go on in there? Holy macaroni. We've got messages that he owes the people of the public. He has to send these messages through cabinet appointments. Where does Kent go? What about O'Brien? What about Labrador? Does this mean Keith Russell's automatically in? Who'll be the deputy premier? Who's going to take on some of the big portfolios with really damning and serious issues facing the people of the province? All the while, how can we have that revolving door offer any faith and confidence to the people when governing is your number one concern, albeit we know full well your number one concern is, rounding up the troops, organize your district offices, want to fundraise and campaign and get reelected. And all the while, this stuff goes on. So if Premier Davis wants to be the leader, the forceful, the open and transparent and accountable leader, if he can't get us the answers, or more importantly, Premier Davis, if you can't answer the questions we have that are yet to be resolved, if you can't do that personally after reading this report and speaking to your members of caucus, then you owe us, in no uncertain terms, an avenue where we can get the answers. And if that means your judicial inquiry, then so be it. Because the onus is on the government, not on anyone else to prove why it's required. The onus is on the government. If you cannot answer those questions, then you owe us an avenue to get them. You want to talk about it? Fine. All right. Wild stuff, boy. And it's not a witch hunt. This is yet again the gang that can't shoot straight. You have every opportunity to follow standard protocol for tenders being offered, contracts being renegotiated and or cancelled, but you didn't follow any of them. So this whip that you created for your own arse is not our fault. This is not a witch hunt. This is not looking for political scalps, because I don't care which one of you is in power, as long as you do the right thing, follow some legitimate procedures. So that's it. What else are they going to do? What can they do?